So, I'm of the mindset that everyone should know a little bit about cars. I've always been mechanically inclined, and it may have saved my life. A few years ago, I met a guy in a dating app. We talked for a few weeks before I was finally willing to meet with him. His dad owned a local gun store where I would go get my target stuff, since I used to be in competitive shooting. I had seen this guy around and had a decent impression of him, but I still wanted to be safe. He invited me to a concert at a local town site. It was a concert I really wanted to go to, and I figured it would be safe, since it was a well-known place with a lot of security. I let him pick me up because he wanted to show me his Mustang. He bragged about how well he kept it running and how he babied it. I was into time trial racing at the time, so I was interested to see what he had done. On the night of our date, he picked me up, and we began heading to the event. Right before the exit, he said his car was acting funny. I was watching the dashboard, and if you've been in racing, you know the cars usually have extra accessories, whether it's aftermarket racks and gauges or switches. There was nothing extra, and the car felt like it was shifting correctly. There were no strange noises or anything to indicate any problems. I told him that was weird and suggested that we should try and limp it to the concert venue since it was less than a mile away and it would be better than being stuck on the highway. He agreed and drove very carefully for the last mile. When we got to the concert, he kept buying me drinks and I kept noticing that he was staring at me. I refused to drink, so every time he brought me something, I'd take it to the bathroom and dump it out. As this went on, he kept making comments about how well I was handling the alcohol. There seemed to be something off with him, and I was super uncomfortable. Once the concert ended and it was time to leave, I noticed I didn't have any cell phone service, so I wasn't able to call anybody to come pick me up. I decided to bite the bullet and go with him after I talked him into taking the old highway instead of the I-15. It sounds silly, but when you take the old highway, even though it's slower, people are more willing to stop and help you than they are on the freeway. I figured if he was having car troubles, it would be safer, and we wouldn't have people flying by us at 80 miles per hour. When we made it halfway between the town site and our town, he said the car was acting funny again and pulled over. I didn't notice anything wrong, so I got out of the car to check it out with him. He started making comments about how I was drunk and should wait in the car instead. At this point, the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, so I pulled out my phone. I noticed I had service again, so I texted my dad. As I was walking away from the engine compartment, I noticed he was watching me, so I started acting like I was trying to get cell service to get help. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched him take the spark plug wires off the distributor cap and switch the order. Spark plug wires connect to the distributor cap based on the order your cylinders fire in, so doing that will either make the car run terribly or prevent the car from even turning on. I managed to send my dad a picture of what he was doing, and he instantly replied and told me to start walking away. Just as I was about to start walking, the guy got back in the car and opened his glove box, which exposed a pistol he had. He told me not to worry and that we'd be safe. I probably broke a world record for how fast I was texting my dad. Again, he told me to start walking and tell the guy that he is on his way and that our friends live up the road. So that's exactly what I did. I started walking at a fast pace and took off as quickly as I could. As soon as the guy noticed, he started yelling at me, and I yelled back, saying I couldn't hear him but I was going to my friends. I was scared out of my mind. The closest road actually led to a cemetery, so there was absolutely no one around to help me. The further I walked, the bad feeling I had continued to get worse. For a quick second, I turned around and looked. The hood was closed and the lights of the car were on, so I decided to walk along the farm irrigation system next to the road where I'd be less visible. As I was texting back and forth with my dad, I heard a car slowly coming up behind me. I turned to look and saw that he was holding a flashlight out of the passenger side window, so I dropped down against the side of the ditch and waited, hoping he'd pass. Once I couldn't hear it anymore, I crawled out and continued walking along the weeds. After what felt like an eternity, my dad finally showed up in his truck. As we made it towards town, we passed the guy and saw that he'd been pulled over by 3 cops. I was pretty shaken up, but my dad told me not to worry about it, and all that mattered was that I was safe. Shortly after the incident, I learned that he had been charged with violent crimes in the past, and that he'd been arrested that night for concealed carrying without a permit. The police never talked to me, but I haven't seen that guy in town since. If I didn't have experience with cars and didn't know what he was doing, I could have been dead in that ditch instead of hiding. This guy knew that I knew about cars, but his whole goal was to get me so drunk that I wouldn't realize what was happening. When I was 10, my parents and I went to visit my grandmother for spring break. My cousin also came to visit, and we decided we wanted to go to the YMCA for the day. My grandmother dropped us off and said she would come and pick us up in 4 hours. On that day, the YMCA was empty. There were a couple of adults in the exercise room, but that was it. We went to the basketball court, and after 2 hours of playing tag and shooting baskets, we were bored. I've never been the biggest fan of swimming, but this YMCA had a pretty cool pool, so we changed into our bathing suits and headed in there. The pool was empty except for the lifeguard. We played a bunch of games and swam laps, but after about an hour, there wasn't much left to do and there was no one except us to hang out with to keep things interesting. So, we decided to play a game of seeing how long we could hold our breath underwater. We stood in the shallow end near the clock on the wall so we could time ourselves. Instead of fully submerging, we just stuck our heads face down in the water. We did this a couple of times, and I was winning. On our last round, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I figured it was my cousin giving up and telling me that I won, but instead, it was the lifeguard who told me to knock it off or she was going to ask us to leave the pool. Since we were tired of being in the pool, we figured we'd get out, get dressed, and go back to the basketball court until my grandmother picked us up. We only had an hour left anyways, and the water was freezing. As we got out, the lifeguard stopped us and asked if we wanted to go into the sauna to warm up and dry off. The sign said 18 years or older, so of course, we were super excited that she allowed us to do that. She walked us to the sauna and unlocked the door. The door was glass and the interior was made entirely out of wood. Inside, above the door, there was a clock, probably to help make sure you were not in there for an unsafe amount of time. The lifeguard stand was adjacent to the sauna, but if you looked out the door you could clearly see it. She followed us in and went over to the thermometer encased in plastic and unlocked it, so she could crank up the heat. I figured that she must have to turn it on each time, so I didn't think anything of it. Both my cousin and I were very short girls, so we couldn't see the temperature that was printed on the thermometer knob, but I knew she was turning up the heat. Then she left and shut the door behind her. I thought I saw her lock the door too, but I thought to myself, why would she lock the door when we might want to get out? I checked the clock and decided we should get out in 10 or 15 minutes. It was already plenty warm in the sauna, but now the room was blazing. It felt nice, because I was cold from the pool. After about 15 minutes, it was starting to get a little bit too hot, and my cousin and I agreed that we should leave so we can get dressed. I went to turn the knob on the door, but it wasn't budging. I thought it might have been jammed, so I shook it, but it still wasn't opening, and then I let my cousin try. She couldn't get it open either. We figured the lifeguard would be back in a couple of minutes, so we sat back down and waited. The room was getting hotter now too, and I really wanted to leave. I got up and started banging on the door, shaking and twisting the knob, trying to get the lifeguard's attention. My cousin got up and joined me. We started screaming at the top of our lungs for her to let us out, but she just stared straight ahead. I don't think there's any way that she could have noticed or heard two little girls banging and kicking on the door and screaming. Now we had been in there for about 25 minutes. It was so hot in the sauna that it hurt to breathe. It felt like my lungs were on fire. My eyes and skin were burning. We sat back down and put our towels over our heads because they were still a little damp and made it easier to breathe. I was so worried about my cousin since she's a couple years younger than me. I looked at the clock and saw that we had been in there for 35 minutes. I got up and walked to the door again and saw the lifeguard just staring straight ahead. Again, I tried to get her attention by screaming and banging on the door as hard as I could, but she didn't even react. I was starting to get pretty dizzy, so I went to sit back down, but the wooden seats of the sauna burned my skin. My towel was completely dry, so I put it underneath me to sit on. My hair was also dry, but I wrapped it across my face to cover my nose. I squinted my eyes so that they didn't burn as bad, but I could still watch if anyone walked past the door. It helped a little bit. My cousin was laying face down with the towel over her head, not moving or saying anything, so I nudged her to make sure that she was still okay. She was, but I could tell that we really needed to get out of there soon because she seemed a bit disoriented. It had been 45 minutes now, and I was extremely nauseous. There was no way that the lifeguard would forget that we were in there, and I thought she would have to come back soon, but there was this little voice in my head telling me that maybe she purposely locked us in there. Finally, a man walked past the door towards the pool, but for some reason, I just couldn't get up. My whole body was on fire and I felt so dizzy. Luckily, this man wasn't going to the pool. He wanted to be let in the sauna and came back with a lifeguard. I saw them walking this way and immediately jumped up to grab my cousin. I knew now that she for sure locked us in there because she pulled out her keys to unlock the door and let the man in. I didn't want to take any chances of us being trapped in there any longer, so as the man was trying to walk in, I was trying to shove our way out. As we were going out, the lifeguard started trying to shut the door and push us back with it. The man was clearly confused about what was going on and said, I think they want out. The lifeguard let out a sigh, opened the door fully, and we ran away as fast as we could into the changing room. We only had about 10 minutes before my grandmother was supposed to pick us up. We were both so shaken up by what had just happened that we didn't say anything to each other as we got dressed or on the car ride home. When we got back to the house, my parents were making us dinner, and I told them the story of what had just happened. They thought I must have been exaggerating, and they didn't believe me. I truly think that that woman was going to let us cook alive in there. The only bit of doubt that I have is what would have happened if we actually died. She obviously would have gotten the blame. What was her endgame? I'm 21 now, but I still think about this interaction all the time. My mom's dog, Punky, was a very sweet, loving dog. She was an emotional support dog, and also trained to be a service dog for PTSD before she lost her leg. I've never seen her get aggressive with anyone in the entire 12 years she lived. She never growled or nipped at anyone. She loved all animals and people, and was a real gentle giant among our little terriers. What I'm getting at here was that her barking at something and being aggressive was so wildly uncharacteristic that I only saw it once. At the time, I was 11. I was at home with my 2 younger siblings. My stepdad was at work, and my mom ran up to the gas station to grab a couple of things. For reference, we lived in a 2-bedroom trailer in the middle of the woods, on a dead-end road at the time. You'd really have to make an effort to get down our road, find our house, navigate down our rickety driveway, and find the door. I was sitting at the computer, watching YouTube videos, when all of a sudden, 2 of my smaller dogs perked their heads up, barked a few times, and started investigating down the hall. The siblings were napping in the bedroom at the end of the hall at the time, so I figured that they got the dogs stirred up. But then, Punky suddenly stood up on the couch with her ears perked up. Her fur rose up on her back and her tail was straight up. Then she started barking very loudly. The bark boomed through the living room and echoed around, and all of a sudden, she lunged off of the couch and tore down the hallway. I was already on edge, because it was literally the first time I'd ever heard her bark. She's a Basenji mix, so her bark is more of a baying sound, but this is a big, loud, alert bark. I stood up and went to look, ready to fight off what I was assuming was a shadow monster in the hallway, based on how the dogs were acting. But then I heard it. Someone was knocking on the front door. We rarely ever had visitors, because of how weird our house was location-wise, so my 11-year-old mind had no clue what to do here. The knock drew the attention of the dogs, and they came running back down the hallway, all except for Punky, and I felt better with our 3 yappy dogs in the room with me, even if they were all the size of New York City rats. I opened the door just a bit, and standing on our porch was the sketchiest man I think I've ever seen. I can still picture him perfectly. He was a really thin, taller man with dark hair and a sunken face. He had bags under his eyes, and had this half-managed hair, sort of like he just gave it a quick brush and then figured it was good enough. Everything about him seemed a little too shallow. His clothes were nice, but they just seemed off. He was wearing a clean, newer-looking t-shirt and jeans, but he had what looked like a suit jacket on. All of his clothes were dark too, despite the fact that it was summer in Texas and the weather was definitely in the hundreds that day. He also had this plain, unlabeled bottle in his hand. It looked like the label had been covered up and taped over. I stared up at him in confusion, because I definitely didn't know this man, and I asked what he wanted. He smiled at me, but it looked forced and fake. It definitely looked exaggerated. Then he spoke in the same voice salesmen or retail workers do. He said, "Hey there, kid. I'm trying to sell this carpet cleaner here." And he shook the bottle at me. "Mind if I come in to show you how good it works?" Alarms were going off in my head because he just seemed so off. Looking back with an adult perspective, the fact that he didn't ask if my parents were home is unnerving, because he probably knew that they weren't, and that's why he was there in the first place. I should have told him to get off of our property, or that I'd have to go get my mom, but I didn't. Instead, I just shook my head and said, "No, we don't have carpet." "Well, it works on other things." And he took a big step towards the door and shook the bottle at me. I started to freak out, realizing our front door didn't even have a lock, so closing the door on this guy would have been useless. At this point, I was terrified as my mind raced trying to decide what to say and do, when all of a sudden, I heard it. Punky had crept up from the hallway, lowered towards the ground with her teeth bared and snarling like she was a feral. She had slobber dripping from her mouth, her ears were down, and she was ready to pounce. The guy heard it too, and as I looked towards Punky, she tried to lunge past me and attack the guy. He freaked out and ran off the porch without another word, booking it down the driveway. I let Punky out along with the rest of our dogs, and they started chasing him. Our small dogs chased him down the driveway and stopped about halfway, barking like maniacs. Punky just stopped on the porch and watched him with her ears perked, just staring at him in the distance. That's when I saw someone join up with him as they continued running down the road. The second he disappeared, Punky's entire body language changed, and she went back to being the sweet dog I knew. She laid back down, with her mouth and throat covered in slobber. I realized my siblings were still down the hall, so I ran to check on them. When I got to the bedroom, my siblings were still sleeping. My relief quickly faded when I noticed that the bedroom window was wide open. The curtains were all pushed to one side, and the items on the dresser in front of the window were moved around. I had no doubt in my mind that someone tried to climb in through the window. From what I could gather, the bedroom door was visible from the couch, where Punky was sleeping, so I think someone was trying to climb through the window before Punky went after them and scared them off, and the man at the door was meant to distract me. They definitely didn't expect Punky, a bigger dog, because most of the time she was inside with my mom. Our smaller dogs were outside more often. I don't know what they intended to do, but after my mom got home, she took all of us to my aunt's house. On our way there, we saw the two men walking up someone else's driveway. I still don't know what their exact intentions were that night, but I'm glad I never had to find out.